Hello, ciao, and welcome to episode 55 of Did you love it? I love it. I just made that. I'm so proud. Isn't it great? Anyway, moving on. We are now in part 5 of The Man Who Was Poe. And that's kind of fun, isn't it? Episode 55, part 5, 555. That means positive changes in angel numbers. We are starting chapter 8, A Perfect Tomb. Drink some water, get cozy, and let's begin. Andiamo. Edmund sat on his hands while Cook talked of little more than the bank robbery. He didn't care a thing about that. He preferred to think about Mrs. Whitman. He thought she was kind. Perhaps he could tell her what was happening, even ask her advice about Mr. Dupin. They seemed to be friends. Before he could make up his mind, Cook finished her bread making and left the kitchen, telling him that Catherine would soon return. When more time passed, however, and Catherine didn't come, Edmund grew increasingly fretful that Mr. Dupin, waiting in the cafe, would be anxious about him. He decided he should tell Mrs. Whitman he must leave. Unsure which way to go, he made his way out of the kitchen and found a closed door. He was about to push it open when he heard urgent voices from the other side. "But when I intercepted that note last night," came a woman's whisper, "I felt obliged to send for you. The man insists upon seeing her, and when you didn't reply, I'm so glad I noticed you next door in the cemetery." "Does she know he's coming?" a man's voice answered. "You may be certain I didn't give her the note." "But can you put him off?" the man asked. "We must try," the woman said. "Despite her infatuation, Mr. Poe is totally unsuitable for her. If she is to marry again, you, Mr. Arnold, should be her husband." "I'm in perfect agreement," the man said. "I'm sure I can provide far better for her. And you." "All the more reason to act quickly," the woman went on. "Everything must be done to get her to see the truth about him. He plans to call upon her this very afternoon. Naturally, I made it my business to invite other people. They mustn't be alone. You must be here, Mr. Arnold. I'm counting on you to expose him, reveal him for what he is, an irresponsible drunkard with not a shed of decency." "Mrs. Powers, I will be only too happy," the man replied. "If he arrives unexpectedly, send Catherine to the hotel." Their voices drifted away. Edmund wondered who they were and what they were talking about. Expose whom? Chiding himself that it was, after all, the business of adults and not his, he cautiously pushed open the door. Now he found himself in a little foyer. A scrap of paper lay upon the floor. Not wanting the servant to think that he had left it there, he picked the scrap up, and when he did, he saw that it had odd writing on it. I'm not going to read this to you. It's a long string of numbers and symbols. It's just a long string of numbers and symbols. Even as Edmund tried to make sense of what he read, Catherine burst upon him. "There you are," she said. "I've been looking all about for you. Quickly now, Madam's waiting." Edmund hastily shoved the paper into his pocket and followed. Dupin stood outside the courthouse, taking in great gulps of cold air, his thoughts reverberating with what he had heard. Edmund was right. His aunt had been murdered. That thought quickly fused with the fantastical image he'd concocted in the courtroom, the vision of the murdered woman haunting the inquest. Dupin tried to shake his head clear. The murder was the last thing he needed to think about. If he was to marry Mrs. Whitman, he must remain fixed to that purpose, clear-headed, sober. It was drink that deflected him, confused him, he told himself. He put his hand to his heart and swore that he would not drink again, ever. So resolved, Dupin decided it would do him good to walk briskly back to the cafe where the boy would be waiting. As Dupin crossed to the east side of the Providence River, he couldn't help but observe the row of fine buildings directly across the way, snug beneath the bluff of College Hill. One building in particular caught his eye, a brick structure with an unusually graceful gable roof. Drawing closer, he realized it was the Providence Bank, the same bank in which last night's robbery had taken place. And on the same night, he noted that the murder had occurred. Wasn't it Throck who had mentioned all of that? Dupin snorted. Criminals often drew attention to their own criminal acts. His interest piqued. Dupin studied the building. It was a structure 3.5 floors high, whose central door, there were no others, was large and flanked by 2 pillars. To either side were small windows covered with bars. The floors above had 5 windows each, also barred. Dupin remembered the cafe waiter saying something about the gold having disappeared like magic. Other people seemed to be curious too. Loiterers were hanging about the bank's entrance, a sufficient number to require posting a guard from the regular Providence police. When Dupin approached, the man held up a hand. "Sorry, sir, you must have particular business to enter today." "My name," Dupin announced grandly, "is Auguste Dupin of the Lowell Insurance Company. I have a particular concern in the matters at hand." The policeman saluted. "Very good, sir," he said, stepping back. "You may pass." Dupin, watched with curiosity by the loiterers, entered the bank. Man, they just let anybody do anything back in the day, huh? Yeah, sure, okay, sure you are. Go ahead. Get in. No ID, nothing. Like, on you go. When Edmund returned to the drawing room, Mrs. Whitman was alone and standing by a window. From the nervous way she pressed her hands together, he could see she was even more agitated than before. "Here's the boy, ma'am," Catherine announced. "Very good," Mrs. Whitman replied, without turning. "You may go." "Yes, ma'am." As she left, Catherine gave Edmund yet another hostile glance. Again, he wondered what he'd done to deserve it. For a moment, Mrs. Whitman remained where she was, staring out the window. Edmund studied her, waiting for the right moment to talk to her about his plight. But the longer she kept her back turned, the greater grew his uncertainty. She appeared so very upset. It seemed hardly right for him to intrude upon her thoughts. At last, she faced him. "Edmund," she began, "I wish to ask you something about Mr. Dupin." Edmund's heart sank. She seemed so preoccupied with Mr. Dupin. How could his concern about Sis interest her? "You said that he had been drinking," Mrs. Whitman continued. "A great deal?" Edmund was not sure how to answer. "Edmund," she pressed, "I need to know the truth, no matter how unpleasant. There's a possibility, a likelihood, that your friend, Mr. Dupin, and I may be—" She paused and shook her head. "I have the greatest admiration for the man and his work. Perhaps you're not aware that I write poetry. It was I who reached out." Again she broke off. "Edmund, would you trust a person who drinks?" It was a question Edmund had asked himself about Mr. Dupin. As for answering, he didn't know what to say. Here was an adult seeking advice from him. He was too startled to speak. Mrs. Whitman, however, took his silence as an affirmation of her concern. She sighed. "Yes, even a little is too much. You call him Mr. Dupin. May I ask why?" The question surprised Edmund. Perhaps Mrs. Whitman and Dupin were not friends after all. Then he recollected that when he first came, she seemed to have forgotten the man's name. "It's his name, ma'am. You know him by no other?" "Should I?" Edmund asked, finding the woman as baffling as Mr. Dupin. Mrs. Whitman bit her lip. "Edmund, how do you come to know him? Are you some relation?" Oh, we met last night. How? Without answering, Edmund looked into Mrs. Whitman's troubled face. To answer that question would be to explain his emergency, and he'd already decided he could not do that. She sighed again. Very well. I wish to give him a message. Yes, ma'am? Tell Mr. Dupin he may come, not at 4 o'clock, as he proposes, but at 3:30. And Edmund, tell him not to come to the front door. No, he should go behind the house, to the small graveyard, whose entrance is on Church Street. We can meet in privacy. No one ever goes there. Now, repeat what I said. 3:30, behind the house, in the cemetery, on Church Street, where no one ever goes. Good, she said. You may leave. Edmund started for the door, but she called him back. You need not repeat what I asked you about him, and, she added, lowering her voice, be advised the maid Catherine works for my mother, Mrs. Powers, not for me. Now hurry and deliver my message. Edmund left her. Dupin walked into the room nearest the bank entrance. 6 clerks, all perched on high stools before high desks, were scribbling away on ledger books by the light of gas lamps. At the back of the room, nearest the coal fire, was an older gentleman whose desk, rather like a pulpit, stood higher than the others. When Dupin entered, everyone in the room looked up. I am, Dupin said, responding to their inquiring looks, a private investigator from the Lowell Insurance Company. I've been sent here to examine the place from which the gold was taken. All heads turned to the rear of the room where the older man was perched. Mr. Peterson, this man called out, show this gentleman the vault. Yes, Mr. Poley, said the young man closest to the door. He had sprung off his stool when Dupin announced him. Dupin turned. Mr. Peterson looked to him to be no more than 16 or 17, the youngest in the room. His eyes were a pert, bright blue. His it says checks, but I think he means cheeks, were round and red, his hair so blonde as to be almost white. This way, sir, Peterson called. He'd taken up a candle and gestured to the hall. Dupin followed. From there, the young man led the way up a central stairwell which corkscrewed to the top. Terrible shocking, isn't it? The young man said as they climbed. All that cold? Gone. When did it arrive? A week ago. Not a secret, I gather. Oh, no, sir, very much a secret, Peterson replied. They're not here in the bank. We all knew it was coming. Mr. Poley, that older gentleman in charge of the accounting room, he gave orders that not a word should be spoken about it. Even as he told you? The young man giggled. Mr. Poley's a regular chatterer, sir, as open as his ledger. No, he's not one to keep a secret. There was great excitement about the gold being from California. They say it's there for picking off the ground. Do you believe that? Some say yes, some say no. Here we are, sir. They had gone up 3 flights and were now on the top floor. Dupin, panting from the effort, stood before a massive black iron door. It was open wide. Did you see this gold arrive? Dupin asked, eyeing the door as if it were an adversary. Adversary? Not me, sir. Mr. Poley told us it came in the middle of the night, in bar form, direct from the ship that brought it here. He said it took 5 men to carry that chest up the same steps we just came up. Did the gold happen to come from a ship called the Lady Liberty? Dupin asked. I can't say that I know. The gold was placed here, said Peterson, nodding to the vault. You're welcome to look in, but I can assure you There's not a thing to be found. They had me clean it out this morning myself. Not a thing. Well, not quite, said Peterson after a momentary hesitation. I did find this. He reached into his pocket and held out his hand. A white button lay on it. Perhaps, he said with a smile, you can solve the mystery. Dupin reached into his pocket. He felt the button Edmund had found and was about to draw it out when Peterson said, Go into the vault, sir. Rest assured, I won't lock you in. The mere idea gave Dupin a turn of nausea. He glanced up into Peterson's smiling blue eyes, then gazed into the vault with discomfort. Tentatively, he took the candle Peterson offered and forced himself to enter. It was as large as a small room, cold, dark, and empty. Dupin was struck instantly by how, once inside, he felt completely cut off from the world. He might have been 100 feet underground rather than, as he knew to be the case, 100 feet above and snug against the hill. He lifted his eyes. The dancing light of the candle flame created the illusion that the walls were moving in and out, as if he were captive within a beating heart. His queasiness increased. More and more unsteady, he put a hand to one of the walls. It was hard, clammy. He cringed back and kept to the middle of the room. Is there no way out or in save the door? He asked. His voice produced an answering metallic echo. His breathing became labored. Just this, Peterson said brightly, rapping the iron door of the vault. But they say it wasn't even opened. Tight as a coffin lid, and still for all that the gold was taken. And the box in which the gold was kept? Dupin asked. He was growing weaker. Perhaps I misspoke, Peterson replied. There was no box. I was told the gold bars were unloaded outside and carried in one by one and placed where you stand. Quite manageable that way. Dupin, fighting off growing dizziness, looked down. What's the floor made of? He asked. Iron. Fearful of total collapse, Dupin knelt to touch the floor's cold surface. When he did, he noticed a bit of string. He snatched it up and put it in his pocket, then came unsteadily to his feet. Hands trembling, he held the candle high. Directly overhead, he saw what looked like a shaft. It had an opening no more than a foot wide and receded up into darkness. And that? An air shaft! To the roof? Peterson stepped forward to peer up. Well, I should think so. Couldn't the thief have come down through there? Dupin managed to say, despite the tightness of his throat. I doubt it, Peterson answered, taking another look. It's far too narrow, isn't it? I'm fairly thin myself, but I couldn't even get through. Yes, Dupin agreed, laboring for breath. No grown person could. The story, Peterson said, is that the man who built this vault had a desperate fear of being locked in. That's why he built the shaft. Otherwise, a trapped person who might not be rescued for days would perish from suffocation. It would make a perfect tomb now, wouldn't it? It was then that Dupin fainted. Chapter 9. News of Sis. As Edmund hurried toward Fox Point, he kept thinking about Mrs. Whitman. Why had she asked him so many questions about Mr. Dupin? Edmund found it all very upsetting, the more so when he realized he had few satisfactory answers himself. He made up his mind that when he reached the cafe, he would ask Mr. Dupin for some. Dupin was not at the cafe, however. Merely puzzled at first, Edmund asked the waiter who had served them if he knew where Mr. Dupin had gone. Oh, him, the waiter said when Edmund offered a description. Well, he went off right after you did. Right after? We did leave a notebook. You sit down. I'll fetch it. Edmund, his anxiousness increasing, sat at one of the tables. In moments, the waiter placed the notebook before him. Edmund gazed at it, wondering what it was that Mr. Dupin had been writing. No, it would be wrong to look. But then, they were his answers that Mr. Dupin had put down. He would take just a glance. Edmund drew the book close and opened it cautiously. On some pages there were just words like search and death. Death, he quickly saw, appeared more than any other. And then there were notes which were so rambling and confused Edmund could make no sense of them. But on one page he was able to grasp something. It was headed, Plot. Story of a search. Boy searching for vanished sister. Wants her to be alive. Of course. No tension there. To be effective must be a puzzle. Is she alive? Enter Dupin. Who took her? Much confusion. But then, boy finds that one can find life only through death. I know. My sis is dead too. Edmund stared at the page, horrified. He recalled Mr. Dupin's questions and his own answers. These lines were much more than that. He reread them. When he reached the word death, that word so often written, he shuddered, closed the book, and pushed it away. There was something very wrong with Mr. Dupin. But, he asked himself, who else could he turn to? He'd already decided against Mrs. Whitman. He considered the night watchman, Mr. Throck, he thought his name was. He'd seen him at the saloon the night before. Perhaps he could find him there again. Then he recalled Mr. Dupin's words that only he, Dupin, would be able to find his sister. The next moment, Edmund reminded himself that in some magical way, Mr. Dupin had figured out that Sis had been stolen. He had even reminded him that on the way back from the saloon, he'd met a white-haired man on the street. Perhaps he would find Sis. Trust adults, his poor auntie always told him. Trust adults. Edmund sighed. Sometimes it was very hard. Too hard. Dupin was drowning, sinking beneath the bay. Cold water seemed to be pouring into him, gagging him, suffocating him. He wanted air desperately, but he was being held by the throat, pushed deeper down. It took superhuman effort to open his eyes, to see who was trying to kill him. It was a man with white hair. It was Peterson, the young accountant, bending over him. Sir, are you all right? Gradually, Dupin's head cleared. The throbbing eased. With Peterson's help, Dupin sat up and looked about, unsure of where he was. Then he remembered. He was inside the bank vault. Feeling acute embarrassment, he held out a hand. Peterson took it and helped him to his feet. Some fresh air might do good, sir, the young man suggested. He guided Dupin to the steps. Hold on to the balustrade. Slowly now. At the lowest level, Peterson paused. Just a moment, he cautioned, and dashed into the office and to Mr. Polly's desk. Mr. Peterson, did you show that inspector the vault? Yes, sir, Peterson whispered, but I'm afraid he took suddenly ill. Mr. Polly became alarmed. Ill? He said loudly. The other clerks turned to listen. Perhaps, Peterson said, it would be wise for me to make sure he reaches his lodgings safely. Good thought, Mr. Peterson. See that you do. I should be much obliged. Peterson started off. Oh, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Polly cried. The clerk turned. Your friend, Mr. Ratchet, came in and left a message for you. He handed Peterson a folded piece of paper. Hesitating momentarily, Peterson took the note. Go on, sir, Mr. Polly urged. You'd best take the time to read it. He said it was urgent. Under Polly's frankly curious eyes, Peterson unfolded the note and read it quickly. When he glanced up, he realized everyone was watching him. Is something the matter? Polly asked. You look stricken. Peterson jerked around. No, sir, he said. Not at all. I'll see to the inspector. Stuffing the note into his pocket, he returned to the hall, relieved to find Dupin still there. The two emerged onto the street. Dupin, aware that they were being observed closely from the crowd of loiterers, turned from them and took in the fresh air. Can I help you anywhere? Peterson inquired. I have permission to see you to your lodgings. Dupin shook his head. I can make my own way, he insisted. To tell the truth, sir, Peterson confided, loath to let Dupin go, I don't intend to be an accountant forever. I've always wanted to be an investigator, like you. I believe a good mind for it. I've read a great deal, too. Eugene Sue and Vidocq, our own Edgar Allan Poe. Have you read The Gold Bug? It's very instructive, I think. I'm afraid, he rattled on, I didn't catch your name when you introduced yourself. Would you be kind enough to give it to me? Dupin gazed at him, then said, Edward Gray. Very good, Mr. Gray, Peterson replied, producing a calling card. Here's one. Dupin glanced at the card. Mr. Randolph Peterson, Hotel American House, and shoved it into a pocket. If ever you need someone here in Providence to assist you in your investigations, Mr. Gray, Peterson pressed, please call upon me. I'm thoroughly discreet. He held out his hand. Dupin shook it lamely. Thank you, he said. Peterson watched anxiously as Dupin walked away. Then he unfolded the note he had been given by Mr. Pulley and studied it. At the hotel, he murmured, only to stop when he realized he was talking out loud. Then he hastened up the hill behind the bank. Two of the loiterers separated from the crowd. One followed Peterson. The second, Mr. Throck, followed Dupin and watched him go into the first saloon he came upon. Oh, no! Edmund continued to wait in the Wickenden Street Cafe, growing more and more troubled the longer Mr. Dupin was away. Then it occurred to him that perhaps he was the one who had misunderstood. Perhaps Mr. Dupin had gone to the room and was waiting there. He quickly snatched up the notebook and raced to his building and up the steps. From the hallway, he saw that his door was open. He stopped short. His hopes soared. Sis had returned. Down the hall he dashed. The room was a shambles. Everything was scattered. The table was overturned. The chair tossed aside. The trunk had been opened, and its contents were spewed about the floor. Stunned, fighting back tears of anger and despair, Edmund began to set the furniture to rights. Then the litter. He turned to Mr. Dupin's belongings, including a shocking number of empty bottles, and put them back into the carpet bag. Finally, he collected all that had been pulled from his aunt's trunk. It was only then that Edmund realized something had been taken. Auntie Prue had had a drawing, a portrait of herself and Mum made by a street artist near Piccadilly Circus just before his mother had gone to America. Auntie claimed it was a good likeness of them both, and had got the picture up in a little frame. She liked to show it to Sis and Edmund, saying that seeing it helped to keep up one's faith. The drawing and that alone had been taken. To Edmund, it seemed a senseless theft. Once the room was set to rights, he flung himself on the bed and looked about. Now that he was alone, now that he had to confront the fact that he might never see his sister or his auntie there again, Edmund realized how empty, how ugly it was. The very cracks on the ceiling and walls, as if they were some contorted message, seemed to spell out the undoing of his life. The thought of a message reminded him of the paper he had discovered in Mrs. Whitman's house. He took it from his pocket and once more tried to decipher it. Unable to, he stuck the paper in his sister's book. His sister's book. Unreadable messages. Ugly, deserted room. A fist of anger hammered in his chest. No! Edmund shouted. Sis not dead. She's alive. She is. Consumed by sudden hopelessness, Edmund flung the book across the room, then hid his face in his blanket. The next moment he was up. He had to find Mr. Dupin. His drinking done, Dupin proceeded unsteadily toward Wickenden Street. When he reached it, he remembered he had wanted to buy Edmund a coat. He entered the first clothing shop he saw. A salesman approached. May I help you, sir? A coat, Dupin said. Don't move, the salesman exclaimed. In moments, he returned holding one. Beautiful coat, isn't it? Dupin looked dubiously. There's a story behind this coat, the salesman said. A man orders a coat. Not cheap, mind you. He has it fitted and cut for him. He comes in, this morning actually, for the final fitting. We're trying it on, when suddenly, with not so much as a by your leave, the gentleman rushes off, and we have not heard from him since. The oddness of the event piqued Dupin's curiosity. No idea what made him go? The salesman shrugged. A boy had wandered in. A boy? A begging boy. I'll tell you what, sir. Oh, it's that same salesman. That man never put a penny down. Of course we took him for a gentleman. Now we've done the work and don't know whether he'll be back or not. Quite a loss for us. That begging boy, Dupin asked, what time did he appear? The man considered. Between 9:30 and 10. Now, sir, he persisted, since we don't know if our customer is coming back, we would be willing to sell you this coat, taking it in a bit at a considerable saving. That way we wouldn't lose, nor would you. What did you say this man's name was? I didn't, sir, but I don't mind saying it's his embarrassment, not ours. Mr. Ratchet was the name he gave. Mr. Ratchet, perhaps you know him. Dupin shook his head. We'd be happy to let you try the coat on, the salesman said. I don't think I'm interested, Dupin said. Though I am getting married and shall want a better coat soon. May I offer my congratulations, sir, the salesman intoned with a bow. Edmund kept running between his room and the cafe. One moment he was sure Mr. Dupin had deserted him, the next that Mr. Dupin was late only because he discovered word of Sis and had gone to fetch her. Then, not knowing what to think, he spent the time inventing new calamities. Another hour passed before Edmund saw Dupin. He was coming down Wickenden Street, not in a hurry, merely strolling, gazing now this way, now that. Edmund, close to tears, rushed up to him. Dupin stopped, studied the boy, frowned, and said, What's the matter now? Edmund stared at him in disbelief. You said you'd wait for me at the cafe. Do you think I have nothing better to do with my time than sit about in such places? But, Edmund, Dupin announced, I could use a drink. He started for the cafe. Edmund stood his ground. Dupin looked back over his shoulder. I have received news of your sister, he said, and continued on. Edmund's resolution dropped away. He raced to catch up. I know we're at 30 minutes, but we only have one chapter left to finish part 1 of the book. So I say that we just plow through it. Chapter 10, The One Who Murdered Her. Dupin took the table where they had sat that morning, then ordered whiskey for himself. Are you hungry? He asked Edmund. Unable to think of anything but what Mr. Dupin might tell him, the boy shook his head. Dupin dismissed the waiter. To Edmund he said, Stop making yourself look so miserable. Suddenly the thought came to Edmund that Mr. Dupin had learned something terrible, but was only waiting before announcing it. He shrank back in his seat. Paying no mind to the boy, Dupin drank for a while, then abruptly asked, What have you been doing with yourself? Edmund looked at him with surprise. You gave me a message to deliver to Mrs. Whitman, he answered. Did I? It was impossible for Edmund to reply. Did I? Dupin repeated. Yes, sir. Dupin leaned over the table and said softly, Did you see her? Mr. Dupin, you told me to. Was she very beautiful? Yes, sir. And did you give her the message as I instructed, only to her and when she was alone? Edmund nodded. How did she look when she received it? Mr. Dupin, you said you had found... Dupin held up a hand to cut him short. Never mind. I can imagine it. He closed his eyes. Mrs. Whitman asked me to give you a message. Dupin looked up eagerly. Which was? That you were to come not at 4 o'clock, but at 3:30, to the cemetery on Church Street, behind the house, so you can meet privately. No one goes there, she said. Oh, good, Dupin exclaimed and drank again. Mr. Dupin, you told me that you found something about my sister. Is that true? Dupin looked up from his drink. Who? My sister, Edmund whispered. Ah, yes, your sister. Yes, I found out something. Edmund sat bolt upright. What? He got out. I know why she was stolen. Why? I'm not prepared to divulge that. But... So you need not ask me any more. Mr. Dupin! Nothing. Deeply frustrated, Edmund watched Dupin, trying to understand him. He remembered the questions Mrs. Whitman had asked him about the man. He thought of the least offensive one, screwed up his courage, and said, Mr. Dupin? What? Where's your home? Dupin glowered. Why do you ask? Mrs. Whitman was surprised you were here. She needn't have been. Are you here on business? In a manner of speaking. Could I ask, what business? No. Stymied, Edmund cast about for another approach, but before he could think of what to try next, Dupin abruptly reached across the table, touched his arm, and said, Mrs. Whitman is a remarkable woman, isn't she? Edmund didn't know how to answer. Helen, Dupin boldly proclaimed, placing fingers to his heart. I love now for the first and only time. Once more he leaned over the table and in a full voice of solicitude said, Do you think I should marry her? It was the second time that day an adult had asked Edmund's advice. I don't know, sir, he stammered. Edmund, I wish you would tell me, in your own words, how Mrs. Whitten received my letter. Edmund's eyes began to fill with tears. Dupin scowled. Now what? Please tell me what's happened to Sis. No. I thought you had gone too, Edmund continued. His voice was choked. Allan wouldn't see you again. You even left your notebook. And you read it. Edmund shook his head. Dupin smiled thinly. Edmund, you asked me my business. I shall tell you a great truth. Are you listening? Yes, sir. I'm a creator of the future. The future? Whose? Mine. And yours. Side note, we're all creators of our own future, and you have to believe that. What about Sis? Hers as well. Can you tell me what will happen to her? Dupin looked at the boy curiously. You read my notes. I'm working on that. Edmund blushed, but asked finally, Is she alive? People say I love death. Do you think so? Well, what difference does it make what you think? It takes us all. Don't you trust me? It was too much. Edmund leaned over the table and pressed his face in his arms. Dupin's eyes flashed with anger. Edmund, do not take my kindness for granted. I'm very close to bringing this business to a satisfactory conclusion, but one rude word from you, and I shall drop it entirely. Edmund tried to stifle his tears. Dupin leaned across to him. Soon, he said soothingly. Soon we shall have a solution, but it shall be my solution, in my time. Now, he declared, I need to shave and change. Can you fetch water to your room? Yes, sir, Edmund mumbled. Then lead the way. Only as they were walking did Edmund remember what had happened in his room. Sir, he said, when I came back from Miss Whitten's and you weren't at the cafe, I thought you might have gone to the room, so I went there. Dupin shrugged. Edmund said, Someone else had been there. Dupin stopped. What do you mean? The room was so torn up. Someone had opened Auntie's trunk. Why didn't you tell me before? Dupin demanded angrily. I forgot. Forgot, Dupin cried. You're the dullest of boys. If I don't resolve this business, it shall be your fault. Edmund felt as if he'd been struck. Now quickly, leave me there. As they hurried now, Dupin asked, What was taken? At first I thought nothing, Edmund managed to say. Then I realized a picture was taken. A picture? From Auntie's trunk. It was one of my mum and Auntie, made just before Mum left for America. Dupin stopped again and looked hard at Edmund. Then he said, Is there anything else you have forgotten to inform me about? Edmund struggled to keep from blurting out his frustration. No, sir, I don't think so. Dupin kept staring. Then he said, Edmund, you're lying. And he turned on his heel and began to walk fast again. Edmund hurried after him, but for the rest of the way neither spoke. At the room, Dupin took one look at the trunk and said, It wasn't forced. Edmund looked at him blankly. The person who opened it had a key, Dupin said. Only my auntie had one, Edmund said. Then the person who came here took it from her. No doubt the person who murdered her. Dupin stood up. Edmund felt his heart contract. Was she murdered, then? Of course. But why? Edmund cried. Edmund, I am soon due at Mrs. Whitman's. Dupin held out the basin. I require water to wash. With a sudden movement, Edmund struck it aside. It clattered to the floor. Dupin jumped back. For a moment the two stared at one another. Then Dupin turned away. Please be quick about it. Sullenly, Edmund retrieved the basin and left the room. By the time he returned, Dupin had changed his shirt. Now he proceeded to shave. Edmund sat on his bed and watched. One moment he wanted to scream out his rage at Mr. Dupin. The next he thought he should get on his knees and beg for him to show mercy. Then he thought the wisest thing of all would be to run away. But in the end, all he said was, Shall I go with you to Mrs. Whitman's? Dupin stopped brushing his jacket. Under no circumstances, he snapped. After a moment, Edmund said, Then what should I do? Anything you wish. Should I wait here? I suppose. When will you get back? Edmund, it doesn't matter to me where the devil you are, just not Mrs. Whitman's. He slipped into his coat. Edmund pulled the blanket around himself. I'll stay here. Dupin approached the door. Feeling a rising desperation, Edmund cast about for some way to hold him. Mr. Dupin, he suddenly said, there is something I haven't told you. Dupin opened the door. Is there? He said, the sarcasm in his voice making the boy wince. It's about my father, Edmund said. Dupin froze. What about him? I told you he'd been lost at sea, Edmund began slowly, finding it difficult to talk through the tightness he felt in his throat. That's what Auntie told us to say. It's true, but that was my first father who died. My mother remarried. It was my stepfather who... Dupin became very pale. He turned at the door. Stepfather, he gasped. Have you a stepfather too? The depth of Dupin's reaction frightened Edmund. He shrank back. Yes, sir, he whispered. I do. And you never told me? Auntie said I mustn't, Edmund pleaded, feeling close to tears. I'm only trying to do what she says. He abandoned Mum after taking her money. It was right after they married. His name? Edmund gulped back his tears and said, I think I never met him. It was a Mr. Ratchet. Ratchet! Dupin exclaimed, stepping further back into the room. I can't remember, Edmund wailed in agony. He misled her and abandoned her. I don't even know what he looks like. Dupin stood over Edmund. But would he know you? Mr. Dupin, Edmund cried miserably. I don't know anything. But I know, Dupin shouted, because he did see you. Shocked, Edmund looked up. What do you mean? When? Where? How do you know? This morning you went in search of a coat. Did you not? You entered a clothing store and were chased out. When you were there, a Mr. Ratchet saw you and fled. Are you sure? Edmund stammered. Edmund, will you never learn? I'm always sure. He leaned close to the boy. The question is this. Can you, who were in the same place with him, can you describe him? Edmund thought desperately. Mr. Dupin, he was standing on a box. He seemed big and fat. Whiskers, I think. He shook his head. That's all, he admitted. Then he said, Did he kill Auntie? Edmund, there are more details you've been keeping from me. Edmund felt his face grow red. But giving way to emotional exhaustion, he nodded. It's about why my mum was coming to America. So when I asked you about that this morning, and you said you didn't know, you lied. Mr. Dupin, Edmund cried. Auntie said, I have no one to help me. I mean... Out with it, Dupin barked. Edmund pushed himself into a corner and gulped down his pain. Finally he said, My mum wanted to find this Mr. Ratchet to get back our money and... His voice sank into a whisper. Divorce him. It's not done in England. It had to be done here, in America. Did she find him? I don't know, sir. Truly, Edmund begged. Please, Auntie said I must never tell. That's why I didn't. Please, you must believe me. Dupin stared down at Edmund. Do you know how much alike you and I are? What? So much the same, even to the stepfather. Except, Dupin added, except for one thing. His eyes were full of torment. What is it? Edmund asked. The death, Dupin replied somberly, of Sis. Don't say that, Edmund shouted. You mustn't. She's not dead. She isn't. Dupin continued to stare at the boy. Edmund flung himself down and buried his face on the bed. Dupin went to the door. There he paused. Edmund, he said softly. Edmund could not face the man. He wished desperately for a word of kindness. You said you were familiar with the workers on the docks. Is that true? Yes. Anyone who could tell you about current ships? Captain Elias. Find this Captain Elias and inquire if there's a ship called the Lady Liberty, where she hails from, date of arrival, cargo, in particular the names of her watchmen. Edmund forced himself to sit up. Can't you tell me why? I wish to know if a Mr. Fontenoy lied under oath, Dupin said. Mr. Fontenoy? He was there on the dock last night, the white-haired one, do you recall? Edmund thought hard, remembering. He nodded. He's the one, I believe, murdered your aunt. So saying, Dupin departed. And that is the end of part 1 of the novel. All right, my friends. That is the end of part 1 of The Man Who Was Poe. Thank you much for sticking it out with me through tonight's episode, especially considered that it was an extended episode. My OCD would not allow me to end it with only one chapter left in part 1, so thank you for being here. And I'm out of town next week, but I may pre-record an episode and schedule it to be posted. Or maybe not. Who knows? Chaos reigns. Anyway, I am happy to have you here. I hope that you have a beautiful week, and I hope that you begin to prepare yourself for the upcoming changing of seasons, of letting things go, letting new things grow in the space that you provide for yourself. And as always, a little love, a little peace, and stay spooky.